So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. And thank you for joining us for this conversation on COP30 and beyond, translating climate commitments into workforce solutions. I'm Sabina Dewan, the founder and executive director of the JustJobs Network. For those of you that may not know us, JustJobs Network is a research organization that focuses on issues related to employment creation, workforce development, and labor market governance. A big part of what we do is trying to understand how forces like technology, climate change, and the energy transition are affecting the world of work, and what is needed to ensure that workers, businesses, and economies can adapt to these unprecedented changes. So today's conversation, coming on the heels of COP30, is very timely. It is part of an initiative called Future Works that the Just Jobs Network is coordinating, and this is supported by the International Development Research Centre of Canada. So we're very grateful for IDRC's support for this line of work. So while we have seen that, COP30 has delivered on mixed outcomes on climate ambitions, we also saw the successful launch of a new Just Transitions work program under the leadership of the United Arab Emirates. And this development seems like very good news because we could see the emergence of just transitions as a central organizing principle for climate action under the Paris Agreement, rather than something that is, sort of an add-on. This framework moves beyond treating a just transition, a just transition as an add-on consideration to really positioning it as a essential component to achieving climate goals in ways that respect human rights, worker rights, and equity considerations. This framework could also help ensure that as economies deal with climate change and undertake the energy transition, that nobody is left behind. So all of this sounds very promising, and in the mixed outcomes on the climate discourse, this sort of momentum behind the just transition is a very welcome change. However, one measure of worth for multilateral frameworks is always how they translate into on-the-ground realities, right? And how does this framework, for example, inform the real inclusion of justice in actual policies, regulations, and practice? So today, I'd like to focus this conversation really on, some of the more concrete issues, facts around how we can actually operationalize the inclusion of human rights, the inclusion of worker rights and equity considerations through a just transition framework as part of our agenda for combating climate change. I am very delighted today to welcome an esteemed set of speakers for this conversation. Andrew Light was the former U.S. Secretary of Energy for International Affairs. Andrew, thank you for joining us and taking time out. Arunabha Ghosh was the Special Envoy for South Asia to COP30. He's also the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water. Arunabha, good to see you. Thank you for being here. And we also have Joanes Atela, who is the founder and executive director of the Africa Research and Impact Network. Thank you for joining us, Joanes. You all are key players have been key players and were key players in COP30 as well. Andrew, you were lead negotiator for various international agreements related to the energy transition under the Biden administrations. These agreements had and continue to have far-reaching consequences for energy policy and governance and strategic relations between countries around the globe. So we're really excited to hear what your contributions will be to this conversation today. Arunabha, you have been a key voice for the Global South, as special envoy and, being based in India, I think you bring a perspective, a much needed perspective into this conversation. And Joanes, you have extensive experience working with African governments in natural resource management, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. So all three of you bring very important and unique perspectives to this conversation. And so today the idea is that we'd like to draw on your expertise to first understand the landscape for climate action and just transitions at this critical time in human history, right? The global landscape today is not only marked by many geopolitical shifts, but also very massive economic and social changes. And so we'd like to understand to what extent is labor and work a real consideration in the discourse and action, in the transition to a sustainable economy. And after we sort of have a conversation about the current state of play in climate negotiations and the energy transition, I'd like to move into concrete issues related to how countries can enable transitions that deliver better development outcomes, especially related to labor market adjustments. So let's just jump right in. Andrew, I'd like to start with you first. You can't have a conversation without first starting with setting the context. And the United States is a big player, globally. And so let's start with that. The U.S. did not send an official delegation to Brazil. The current administration is focused on energy dominance as opposed to mitigating climate change and enabling adaptation and an energy transition. So could you talk a little bit more about that? How is the rest of the world responding to this new sort of stance and a break away from the position of the Biden administration? What was the mood at COP30? Does this set back the progress that was already made, and does it stymie further progress? Can we address climate change and the need for the energy transition without the United States? Can you lead us and start us off on this conversation?
Thanks very much, Sabina. It's really appreciate it. It's an honor to be part of this panel with you and Arunabha and Joanes. And I'm a great admirer of the work of JustJobs Network for a long time now. And so it's great to see not only this convening, but also the way that you started off, talking about, I think, one of the underappreciated achievements of this particular COP, despite what the US has been doing since President Trump was inaugurated last January. So I'll break it down into three parts of your question. One is, how's the rest of the world responding to the United States, one of the key architects, right, of Paris, once again, implementing a stress test on the entire architecture, a global architecture of climate governance, by pulling out of the Paris Agreement. And I think there's clearly good news and bad news. I think the good news is that, once again, as we saw with the first time the Trump administration pulled out of Paris, no one is following the United States out of the Paris Agreement. I don't expect anyone will. I think in addition to the ways that you sort of framed diplomatically the US position, pulling out of Paris, abandoning our NDC, not contributing to adaptation, I think that all we need to look at is what President Trump said at the UN General Assembly opening in September. He said that climate change was the biggest hoax, right, ever perpetrated on the globe. He said, that there's nothing to see here. This isn't real. This is a sham. Made it very clear that the United States not only is softened or retreating from its official position on this issue globally, but takes a position that I don't even think you see anywhere else in the world at this point, with any major sitting government. So it's sort of I think to see any government pull out of Paris and follow the US lead there is really to put yourself into a very small camp, which doesn't have any support. The bad news, of course, is that, and I'm actually beaming in here from Nairobi. I'm here for the the 7th UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi. And we see some of what's going on at UNEA 7, that we saw in 𝗽𝗲𝗻. You're seeing an emboldening of the voices, particularly from countries that are primarily in the business of the export of fossil fuels, with respect to diminishing global ambition and doing what they can to throw sand in the gears of some progress. The clear way that we saw this in 𝗽𝗲𝗻, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is the sort of the ambition that President Lula had to try to get a roadmap towards the sort of one of the signature achievements of the Dubai COP 2 years ago, this language of a commitment to transitioning away from fossil fuels, this consensus language from all 195 parties, to try to develop some kind of roadmaps or a process to start a roadmap or something, to begin to put some kind of substance to that ambition, which followed years and years of debate over phasing down or phasing out fossil fuels or coal or whatever that was going to land. So we're seeing that here. We saw it, yes, we saw it basically unfold yesterday here in Kenya with the launch of the 7th Global Environment Outlook report, which for the first time doesn't have a summary for policymakers because the US sort of phoning it in and other countries, a few other countries sort of stopped agreement on a consensus summary for policymakers. You've still got the message and the core science done there, so that's very good, but refusing to go along with the core message, which of course, something we all know, which is just true, and it's a fact that whatever President Trump wants to say, you can't get around it. Humans are causing climate change. The primary cause of climate change, of course, is emission of fossil fuels, and the primary source of emissions of fossil fuels is from energy. So we're sort of seeing that kind of emboldening. Now, how did it impact the mood? So the part two, I'll say, of what you asked, how did it impact the mood at COP30? I think that it was measured. I think on the one hand, there was hope, even at the end of the first week, that you could do what President Lula said and get some kind of really substantive collective thing on transitioning away from fossil fuels as a kind of a new unexpected breakthrough at the COP. I even talked to one lead negotiator from one main party that ended up blocking any language on this, who really saw that there was a way to at least an initial movement forward on this topic, but it really retreated. And I think, again, there was an emboldening there. If the United States was there, it would have been worse, frankly, because there is no counterfactual where there's any administration other than the Trump administration that shows up to these international meetings, whether it's here in Kenya or at 𝗽𝗲𝗻 or anywhere moving forward. That's what we have to work with. They would have only kind of made that opposition, I think, worse there. On the other hand, I think that, again, and I'll just use the example that you gave, the UAE work program on just transitions. We could also talk a lot about, for example, the 𝗽𝗲𝗻 Gender Action Plan, another great unappreciated achievement of the COP, where you've got a substantive piece of work on a critically important issue that we've been talking around as a global community, but not really moving forward for. And a really good process. There were 4 listening sessions on that just transition work program that were led by an array of global actors, including Germany, Egypt, Panama, Ethiopia, that led to the production of that work program and a commitment to really moving forward. And in addition to that, not just the work program, but there was the launch of a new global initiative on jobs and skills for the new economy, led by Kenya and Germany, with a variety of actors producing their first breakthrough report, a really substantive report, which I'd love to hear debate on, and more information from you and other experts on this about what's good, what did we know, what's obvious, what in that report. But also, if you look at the big thing this year was, of course, countries putting forward their new nationally determined contributions for the period of 2035. This is the 3rd commitment period under the Paris Agreement. And we are seeing progress there, where when I was a climate negotiator in the State Department in the United States during the second Obama administration in Paris, we were looking at a world where we're going to see 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius increase in temperature over the global average by the end of the century. Now we're looking at slightly less than 3. It's not great. That's not where we want to be at all. It's not the Paris targets, but it's way better than what we thought we were going to see when we were negotiating 10 years ago. And so we're seeing some progress. It's not as strong as it is, but it is there. But for example, 92 or 80% of the NDCs that were submitted in this process, these Paris commitments before 𝗽𝗲𝗻, included something specifically on just transitions. 92 of them. And not just a throwaway word here, but an actual description of something substantive. We saw this, for example, with Colombia and Sri Lanka and other countries where they're really working hard on this and already ahead of this work program that was agreed to, led by the UEA in Belém. So there's really good progress there. And I think things that we should focus on, not just these lofty statements that Brazil shot for that didn't get there. And then finally, I'll just say quickly, when you said, can the world move forward? Well, yes, we have no choice. We have to. But I think we're going to get some unexpected help. One thing that people will hopefully remember from the first time the Trump administration pulled out of Paris is US states and cities, churches, universities, others stepped up and said, we are still in. We're still going to try to follow what my former administration, the Biden administration, we did put forward a US NDC to 2035 right at the end in December of last year. This administration is not going to try to implement it, but it's a roadmap there for subnational actors to move forward on. But more importantly, what was done in the Biden administration, and this is something I'm happy to say more about later, was one of the biggest pieces of environmental legislation we've ever seen in history, the Inflation Reduction Act. If you take the clean energy portions of Trump's budget bill, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, signed on July 4th, and you imagine that the Inflation Reduction Act never existed, just the clean energy portions that still remain there. So nothing on EVs is over. Solar is kind of on life support. Wind is definitely not a business to get into in the United States right now, but a whole bunch of other things, nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture sequestration, utility scale batteries, and on and on and on. If you just take that carve out, that's the biggest piece of environmental legislation or regulation in the world outside of China ever passed. So there's a footprint that still remains. You'll still get some help from the United States on the global transition, despite the position of this administration, where I started mentioning the president's comments at UNGA. And while I hate that the United States is in this position, I think that absolutely we can see a transition to where we need to be, even with the US out of it for now.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. In a world that can sometimes seem very bleak, you certainly bring expertise, insights, and a lot of hope to this conversation. So thank you for that. I think it's really interesting to hear about, on the one hand, emboldening of voices and actors that are responsible for perpetuating fossil fuels and this kind of carbon intensive lifestyles. And on the other, the very substantive changes from the Gender Action Plan to the jobs and skills focus to the just transition framework coming out of COP30. So countries that are really doing not just paying lip service, but substantive work to kind of put meat on the rhetoric that has been going on for so long. So it's interesting to see kind of the juxtapositioning of these two different factions, as it were. Arunabha, I'd love to bring you into the conversation now. In your remarks at COP30, you noted that countries, cities, and companies in the global south are meeting their goals ahead of time with a bias for action. That's a really powerful statement. And you also went on to say that distributed clean energy for livelihoods is a $50 billion opportunity. And in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, solar irrigation is a $12 billion opportunity. I'd love to bring you into the conversation now to kind of take forward, what Andrew said in terms of countries taking real action around just transitions, gender, jobs, and skills. Could you say a few words about how the Global South is approaching climate action and the just transition imperative? What has been going on in that regard in the Global South? And could you say more about these opportunities that you talked about? Over to you, Arnaba.
Yeah, thank you, Sabina, and good day to everyone. And hi to Andrew. Very nice to be on this panel with Andrew and Joanes. And thank you, Sabina, for bringing us all together. Let me reflect on your question in two different ways. The first is um, recognizing what is already happening in the global south. And the second is recognizing the opportunities that are still untapped in the global south. At COP30, I argue that if this has to be a COP of truth, we have to recognize that there are many different truths. And one of the truths that is not easily internalized unless you're in the weeds is the scale of actions occurring in the global south. And this is ex-China. Let's take for granted the scale of interventions that are happening in China, for instance, in terms of renewables deployment. But consider the host country. Obviously, it is a hydropower superpower. But next door, Uruguay has had a rapid growth in renewables, wherein a large share of its energy generation is coming from renewables. Come to sub-Saharan Africa, you see South Africa, which is highly coal dependent, also demonstrating a significant increase in its clean energy deployment. Upward in East Africa, again, one of the world's largest networks of distributed energy infrastructure deployed. Egypt, already at over 10% of clean energy generation share in the overall mix, but the target is significantly higher over the next decade. Then in Asia, Thailand or Vietnam. Vietnam is not the largest economy in Southeast Asia, but has the highest deployment of clean energy infrastructure in that region. And of course, my own country, India, which has already achieved 50% of deployed capacity as part of its overall electricity capacity, 5 years ahead of schedule. Now, I'll be the first one to say capacity is one thing, generation share is another. So India is at about 23% generation share. And I think if we met the 50%, if we met the 500 gigawatt target by 2030, we think it could be closer to 43, 44% of electricity generation coming from non-fossil sources. If we pushed even harder, say went for 600 gigawatts as opposed to 500 gigawatts, our estimation at CW is this would be actually the lowest cost power delivered while making sure that the grid is resilient and stable, and yet avoid any further build out of new coal. Now, all of this suggests that there are multiple pathways towards the energy transition, but which is playing out at scale across a sufficient number of geographies that they should not be dismissed as mere anecdotes. So I argued in Belen that before we fill the ambition gap, we must also fill the perception gap. And this perception that action is not happening in the global south is misplaced. The second thing I wanted to say is that there is also opportunity that is untapped, and that is in the much wider definition of green economy, at least as we see it at CEW, which includes the energy transition, but also includes the circular economy. It includes the nature and bioeconomy. So to give you a sense of the scale, we estimated, before the pandemic, we estimated that there was a $50 billion opportunity for distributed clean energy infrastructure being used for livelihood activities in rural India alone. After the pandemic, we estimated that there's a $12 billion opportunity in using solar irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa. We have now continued to analyze and in some cases actually support dozens of startups to put our theory to the test. So the latest numbers that we released just last 2 weeks ago, we estimate that the green economy overall in India, which includes energy, clean energy, circular and bioeconomy, could attract $4 trillion in cumulative investments over the next 2 decades and create 48 million full-time equivalent jobs. Now, this is not pocket change. This is not trivial. This is actually, we can almost think of green economy as like the internet and like AI, perhaps another general purpose technology that drives economic growth, but sustainably at scale. But what's particularly exciting from our perspective is how the jobs coefficient plays out. The bioeconomy, in our estimation, has the highest jobs to investment ratio. For every $1 million of investment, 100 jobs can get created in the bioeconomy, 64 jobs can get created in the circular economy. And in the energy transition, the jobs coefficient is lower, the 4 jobs per $1 million invested, but still that is higher than what you would get from fossil fuel investments. So whether you take jobs, whether you take growth, whether you take sustainability, and this has been our mantra consistently for several years now, we see that a push towards the green economy is a highly undertapped opportunity, but which also offers the Global South a new way of presenting what climate action could begin to look like, which is much more just and inclusive and not just a binary between a dirty molecule and a clean electron.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Arunabha. And of course, being an organization that focuses on the jobs issue, I can't but hone in on that particular set of points that you made. And I have a quick follow-up for you on that. So, if we look at many of the opportunities that you've just highlighted and what sounds like significant job creation potential of investments in those particular sectors, right? The sort of jobs to investment ratio, looking at solar and opportunities there. I'm wondering two things. One, do we have the architecture in India, for example? But I think this is also a generalizable point to the Global South more broadly. Does India have the architecture to actually be able to transition workers from fossil fuel sectors to other sectors, and not just fossil fuels to renewables, but also, this is my second point, that there's going to be cascading effects of an energy transition in the economy, right? So, and by what I mean by these cascading effects is between 45 to 50% of Indian railway revenue comes from the transportation of coal, which is then used to subsidize low-cost fare for workers that are using the railway system, right? If fossil fuels go away, that revenue stream goes away. I'm obviously simplifying all of this. And then there's cascading effects in the steel sector and so on, where there will be enormous job disruptions and labor market disruptions as the economies transition, right? So question one is, do we actually have the architecture to avail these opportunities that you have talked about? And by architecture, I mean skills training, portability of Social Security, that kind of architecture that enables workers to transition. And two, if you have any thoughts or comments on, how do we deal with this sort of cascading impact of these transitions, of climate adaptation, mitigation, and the energy transition on, economy-wide sort of effects? And, it is an imperative, we know that, but what needs to happen? How do the opportunities square up against the disruptions?
Let me answer your second question first, and this goes back to how it played out at COP30 as well. There is no question that we had the UAE consensus on transitioning away from fossil fuels, but if you actually look at what President Lula said, he said we need roadmaps. He said it in the plural for transitioning away from dependence on fossil fuels. Now, it's extremely important to emphasize the plural roadmaps and this word called dependence, because the challenge we had at COP30 was that while this was not an agenda item, it suddenly got a lot of attention and traction, both in favor and opposed. But one of the reasons for this was that this issue of roadmaps was distilled down to a roadmap. I think that is problematic because there cannot be a singular roadmap to a transition away from fossil fuels. The second aspect is the dependence on fossil fuels, which goes directly to what you're saying, and I close my earlier comments on that basis, that this is not just the binary between a dirty molecule and a clean electron. When we say dependence, it means many other things. It means public finance. It means revenue from other sources, as you described, for instance, transportation of coal via the railways. And of course, it means the jobs dependency. So that does not mean we cannot transition, or that does not mean we shouldn't be developing those roadmaps. And in my 10-point speech that I gave to the ministers in Belen, and it's there online for those who want to read it, I outlined a more nuanced approach of how we think about the evolution of the power sector and the infrastructure with relation to the grid, the opportunities in the digital space to create much more interactive and decentralized grid, which would also be more jobs intensive, but also the human aspect. As I said, we can repurpose the physical asset, we can re-engineer the financial asset, but the human asset cannot be dealt with only by issuing a voluntary retirement check. So this is where the story really needs to play out. And I think that is also where the new just transition mechanism, as well as the text as it identifies and acknowledges that there will be different pathways and different transitions, is the kind of nuance that we need to inject within and outside the COP process. If we did that, I think we can actually create a larger community of doers when it comes to the transition and isolate those the deniers, so to speak. But if we only left it to a binary and if we only said there is a singular roadmap and that it has to be suddenly agreed and approved, it will create this kind of a pushback because we've not thought through these other aspects. That brings me to your other question. And yes, the short answer would be no, we don't have it all. But the longer answer is actually, if you look at the 36 different value chains that we evaluated, in many cases, there is an existing workforce, but which hasn't been given the opportunity at scale. Leave aside energy transition for a second. If you look at the bioeconomy and nature-based solutions, you've got agroforestry, bamboo-based products, we've got bio-based packaging, biofiber manufacturing, chemical-free agriculture, nutraceuticals, seaweed cultivation. And some of these, there are existing communities, some wetland management. And in some cases, there will have to be some training, etc. That will, and I don't mean it in a kind of dismissive way. This is a multi-decadal transition we're talking about. But equally, we cannot say that just because we have millions of people currently employed in one sector or dependent on, say, coal, etc., that they can never envision an alternative future. The whole point about a green economy paradigm as a general purpose technology approach is that you have to think of it as a whole of country, whole of government approach. It's not going to be done by just a singular scheme here and there. That's why we've also looked at the range, 36 new value chains that we've evaluated in very granular ways. So it's different geographies, different districts, different sub-districts will offer comparative advantages in these areas. But the paradigm shift has to start with a mindset shift that we have to start exploring these alternative pathways before we just say this plant can be shut down or not because there are a certain number of people employed.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Arunabha. Joanes, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now. And, sort of Arunabha talked about the need for multiple roadmaps and then, spoke specifically about these potential opportunities and a little bit now in his follow-up remarks on the operationalization of different opportunities in value chains, different opportunities to create jobs in these sort of green economy related value chains. I'd like to sort of get your insights on the state of climate adaptation and energy transition in Africa. How will the energy transition and climate change disrupt labor markets? We know, for example, that Africa faces tremendous demographic pressure with its large and growing youth populations. So there's this need for more and better job creation at the same time that you have the effects, the deleterious effects of climate change and kind of managing the disruptions, but also the opportunities of undertaking an energy transition. So I'd like to get sort of your inputs on, what does this look like in Africa? We've heard about sort of the United States. We've heard about, many of the initiatives that different developing countries are undertaking. And, maybe you could hone in a little bit more to give us insights into what's happening in Africa. Over to you, Joanes.
No, so thank you so much, Sabina, and of course for bringing me to this conversation. I want to first of all agree with some of the comments that colleagues have made. I think there is really a good room and a good opportunity for just transition and the ambitions associated with that to be achieved. And this came out quite clearly in COP30, where even from the Africa's perspective, most African countries pushed for a more sort of ambitious transition through renewables. But while we do have a very good global ambition towards just transition, I think there are a couple of things that actually reflect the Africa situation, because then when you move this ambition to the context of Africa, then you realize that there are many pathways to it. It's not a one-fit process. So there are many pathways to through which the just transition aspects or sort of ambitions are actually being operationalized within Africa. And those pathways basically define the aspect of justice as well. Because you see, when we talk about just transition, it's not just about transition from fossil fuel to renewables, but it's about the justice in that process. And that concept of justice is always lost at the implementation stage. In most African countries, you realize that the justice lens of things is not always taken into account. So looking at this in terms of the various pathways, we see a lot of policy transition with regards to energy transition. So most African countries have put in place policies that really embrace and are ambitious around renewable energies. That is very good, and that's something that is a big milestone in the continent. We also see a lot of technological transition, where we see a lot of practices renewable energy sort of initiatives. Like Africa now, electricity remains a major target for most African countries to achieve sort of universal access to electricity for the population. But again, you realize that the technological transition with regards to energy transition is actually a lot more driven, not from Africa itself. Of course, other than electricity, we have the solar, we have the wind, but what we see is that a lot of these are driven from outside. And therefore, that also brings the question about who owns the transition and who owns the aspects of the sort of the consequences of that transition, whether job losses and stuff like that. We have market transitions as well, where markets are evolving to be able to really take advantage of the new ambition around renewable energy. Again, the market transition is largely not driven from the public purview, but mostly by the private sector. But the most important transition, Sabina, that I think is critical when you talk about justice is the social transition. And this is where jobs are actually located. Unfortunately, as we speak today, most African countries do not have frameworks that basically tries to safeguard the impacts of the transition from fossil fuels to renewable. So that means the element of justice, as I said in my opening statement, is actually lost in that process. So in a number of cases, just transition has been taken just to mean transitioning from fossil fuel to renewable energy options. And in doing that, as I've said, the lack of frameworks, lack of institutional arrangements or mechanisms to safeguard the implications means that a lot of jobs are actually at risk with the transition. But this is not properly tracked. This is not properly taken into account to ensure that we are aware of these transitions, the impacts of these transitions, and what they mean for the different social groups. And there lies a major gap in terms of the justice. And finally, Sabina, as I want to conclude, I think the aspect of financing the just transition element remains a bit weak again in Africa, while there is real ambition by most African countries to adopt renewable energy. Financing that process remains very unclear. And the role of the private sector within the continent is still very weak. I think most of the processes are driven by international private sector actors. And again, that brings us to the question around who owns the transition and who owns the jobs and whose jobs are created, are replaced, are lost. So those are questions that are important in the just transition pursuit in Africa, but still are not properly or effectively tackled in the process of operationalizing just transition in the continent. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joanes. I think you raise very, very critical points, both in terms of the capacity of countries to actually undertake this transition and particularly manage the social disruptions that will occur. So, do they have the technical capacities, the policies, the fiscal space to do that? And I think that's what I was referring to as architecture. Is that architecture to enable a transition available in many countries in the global south, given particularly the debt crisis that many countries are also facing and the fiscal restraints? So that's one, I think, very important question. And I hope we can come back to that and talk a little bit more about that. And then the second point that I think you raised, which is also very interesting is the difference between, this question of who owns the transition and therefore who do the benefits accrue to. Is it, private company, is it international private companies, or is it, African local companies? I think those are really important questions, and I'd like to loop back to those in the next round that we go to. But I'd like to just take a second, Andrew, and come back to you. Because before we get into sort of some more, I want to go back to Joanes with these to come up with some potential answers for these two very important questions that he raised. But I also want to go back to something that Arunabha said, which is, there have to be many roadmaps. They can't just be one roadmap. And many developing countries define their development priorities as industrialization, energy access, and poverty eradication. But these goals haven't historically been emissions reducing, right? They've actually required increasing emissions. One of the things I've talked about quite frequently in some of my work is also looking at, the importance of actually increasing consumption for many in our developing countries where, we want better cooling options and, as there's greater heat stress, and we want to actually increase consumption for many of the vulnerable families and communities. And so these sorts of development goals aren't always in line with decreasing emissions and the green agenda, right? And sustainability agenda. So can these genuinely coexist with these, sort of combating climate change kind of agenda that we're looking at? Or are the sort of nationally defined caveats throughout the Just Transition Work Program a diplomatic escape clause that allows countries to prioritize development over mitigation, right? If you can pit those two against each other, which I'm purposely being provocative. And are development priorities reconcilable with climate mitigation? If you could take a few minutes and talk about that, and then, we can go to the other panelists as well. Thank you. Over to you.
Sure. No, that's the most important question there is, I think, with respect to the situation that we face today. And if development priorities like energy access and poverty eradication are incompatible with climate mitigation, or put it the other way, if climate mitigation is incompatible with energy access and poverty eradication, we have to make it compatible. We have no other choice. There is no pathway forward, either for achieving our development goals or for achieving our climate goals, other than making these two things compatible. Why? Well, we know, and I was the lead negotiator for the US in the Obama administration on the climate goal for the Sustainable Development Goals. And I mean, if you take a global map of places in the world that desperately need development and places in the world which will suffer the most from climate change, it's almost an exact overlay. So we know that climate change will unravel the development gains that we've seen for the last 50 years, which organizations like yours have worked on in a variety of ways. And so we have to make these things. We need to solve the climate crisis in order to continue that development gains, and those development gains are absolutely essential. Now, what's the key to the problem here? Historically, and this is another way of putting the way that you framed it, it's unfortunate but true that fossil fuels have been the fuel that have driven the engine of the achievement of global prosperity, right? That's a fact about the structure of the economy and the evolution of energy technologies that we've seen. I'm going to focus on energy. We could talk about land use and other things as well, but just to think about that as the largest single source of greenhouse gases. So part of the key to this is you must decouple economic growth from growth in emissions. And think of this in two ways. With respect to the global South, it would be fundamentally unjust to imagine a future where we did not continue to not only lock in the gains we've made on eradication of poverty, on industrialization and energy access, while achieving our climate goals. It's almost an iron law of development that if you're in a state of energy poverty, you can't get out of poverty. So energy access has been absolutely essential, for example, for a country like India, in order to see movement with respect to development gains, and so that needs to be preserved. And then, I mean, it's less important, but it's politically absolutely essential. And you frame this at the very top of this conversation, talking about geopolitical realities. Here's a geopolitical reality: if you're in a democratic country, and let's say you're in favor of ambitious climate action and transition of your economy, you're not going to stay in power very long in the current geopolitical context if you slow down economic growth, given the way in which we've seen, especially in the United States, how this can become a wedge issue that then has been used to unseat some elected officials, not only, but there. So we have to make those things compatible. So the way that Arunabha framed it, and you've reframed it, and Joanes also framed it, this notion of, so what's the key? Well, the general issue is simply, as we've been saying, it cannot be one pathway, right, to transitioning away from fossil fuels or decoupling economic growth from growth in emissions. It's got to be many pathways. And it's astonishing to me, and I will try to say this in ways I can do this without kind of revealing, 4 years of negotiations I was in. In the Biden administration, a very pro-climate government. I mean, I was aligned with India and Saudi Arabia and other parties at the G20, for example, in insisting that we not talk about an energy transition, but energy transitions, plural. And it's astonishing to me how much I had to argue with other parties who said, oh, it has to be an energy transition, as if there's one size fits all. And that's absolutely absurd. If you know anything about the complexity of the way the dynamics of economies and growth, achieving our development goals, achieving our political stability goals, and all the things we want to do that in terms of growing jobs. Now, the fact of the matter is that as Arunabha said, and you've indicated, Sabina, the opportunities are there. And Arunabha gave a great rundown of some of the examples of the potential, the trillions of dollars of potential in one country, an important country, the biggest country by population in the world, and that India's got to achieve its energy transition, its development priorities. If it doesn't, right, it's very difficult for the rest of the world to achieve our climate stabilization goals. A lot rides on this, and we all need to work together to make sure that opportunity is seized, and the job creation goals there are vast. But and the good news here is that we have indications that this not only can work in India, but it can work globally. So just two things, and I'll stop. The International Energy Agency estimates that in last year, so the last year we have complete records in 2024, we did see a decoupling, as we've seen trends of this before, of expansion of electricity delivery in the world and decoupling of that from growth in emissions. So in 2024, 40% of electricity globally was delivered through clean energy sources. This is something that 10, 15 years ago, no energy analyst would have predicted we'd be at 40%, right, in 2024. The transition has been enormous, and the cheapest power there is on the planet is solar plus batteries, period. So that's one of the reasons why the Trump administration can throw whatever, sand in the gears of solar power in the United States. I think that it's going to continue to move apace because it is the cheapest way, for example, to power up data centers, which are the biggest source of expansion of electricity delivery in the United States. But more important than that, and we haven't talked a lot about finance, and it is absolutely regrettable that the United States is not going to be contributing to climate finance, certainly not directly. But again, we're seeing investment in the clean energy economy is robust. And again, far bigger than anyone would have predicted 10, 15 years ago. So in 2024, there was $1 trillion invested in the global clean energy economy, all in. If we look at all of it, 10 years ago, it was 185 billion. Now, just imagine that. 10 years ago, the X factor of the growth from 185 billion in that economy 10 years ago to $1 trillion in 10 years is enormous. I agree. It's like what we saw with the internet. It's what people are seeing with respect to AI, whatever you sort of think about what AI might do on the downside. But the potential here is really something. And it's a question of harnessing that and using it to decouple growth and emissions from growth in the economy, and then find those multiple pathways to achieving poverty eradication and energy access in a way that actually serves our climate goals rather than potentially creates this false dichotomy between them.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a couple of quick follow-ups. As you were talking, I was also thinking about how our current lifestyles are so deeply entrenched in sort of a carbon intensive way of doing things, and that there's a path dependency there, right? We fly to conferences, we consume meat, we rely on e-commerce deliveries, and we power AI through energy intensive data centers, as you pointed out. So are we actually capable of making the fundamental changes that are required to address climate change? And particularly, you brought up the finance point. So there is a great deal of investment that's happening in the green economy, as you pointed out, but in the absence of US financing. Just I've sort of put together both of these questions. I'd love to get your reaction to those.
Sure. Yeah, so a couple thoughts here. And one, and I should have said this, I absolutely have a lot of sympathy. You didn't put it exactly like this, but look, there's multiple efficiencies that we could achieve in energy and many sectors. As we sort of sat around the table, the International Energy Agency was on when I was on the governing board there. Efficiency is the first fuel. That's the first thing you need to do is reduce consumption and figure out ways to do this. Denmark is like a leader in energy efficiency, so they would always insist that every document, so you start with efficiency is the first fuel, and I think there's absolutely something to that. There's also a lot of, to borrow a term that 𝗽혜𝗲𝗹𝗍, a philosopher from Oxford, coined 20 years ago. There's a lot of luxury emissions which make no sense, and this is part of the global conversation, right, about sort of how many billionaires do we need on this planet? And not to sort of open this into that conversation necessarily, but look, these are live and important conversations that we need to sort of think about on this. And I think that Prime Minister Modi has promoted the Life Initiative. There are kind of multiple examples of this, where we sort of try to sort of imagine kind of a future which is not just fundamentally driven by conspicuous consumption in the multiple ways in which you're right. We're locked into these measures. Can we break out of this? We can, but we have to manage it. And we have to manage it in such a way that we remain politically viable for those governments who are committed to actually making inroads on this. This is a completely different conversation, but I've been fascinated watching the coverage over the last 2 days of this move in Australia to ban social media, right, for 16-year-olds and under. This is a big move. I got one kid who would be outraged, right, if this was implemented in the United States, or if we lived in Australia and suddenly, had to give up, right, their smartphone and all the platforms that they work on. But it has a ton of support on both sides of the aisle in Australia because it was introduced in a measured, rational, responsible way. Will they have complete fidelity with respect to implementing it? Absolutely not. But there are ways to do this. You can imagine doing it in food systems. You can imagine doing it in other ways. So that you try to detangle yourself from a kind of a luxury-driven economy with respect to different sectors that do trap people in these cycles of consumption that are not about getting out of poverty. They're about sort of something else. So I think that this is something there, but it needs to be politically sensitive. It needs to be owned by countries, not with interference from the outside. Otherwise, it is absolutely not going to be successful. And the question is, what are the ways in which we can share understandings of what could and could not work in those contexts? I, for one, am going to be asking my friends in Australia, like, how did they make this work? How could they possibly do this? Because again, I couldn't implement it in my own home today if I wanted to.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. Thank you, Andrew. And I think we definitely need to have another webinar on how many billionaires do we need on the planet. But yes, those were very insightful remarks. And I think there's a need for us to do a lot more thinking on, on how we sort of balance the political realities of what is needed with the sort of social demands, right? And how do we kind of how do we move forward with a climate mitigation adaptation agenda, the energy transition, while taking into account the social structures and the political realities? So thank you for shedding more light on that. Arunabha, I'd like to come to you. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm just going to read them out, and I'd love to sort of get your reactions. One question is directly, directly asking of you that, you talked about these 45 million jobs. Could you talk a little bit more about what they would look like? Would they be formal jobs with permanent contracts and Social Security, right? This is always a very, very important point, that when we're talking about the transition, if we take coal India jobs that are public sector jobs, there's a lot more protections versus moving into what is increasingly becoming a very precarious sort of landscape in the private sector for employment, right? And so these jobs has your work shed any light on the quality of these jobs, which is what I think the question is getting at. And then another question is, what are the challenges or progress at the intersection across climate change skills development and platform work? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but let me pause there for a second and see if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, Sabina, of course, these are jobs that are yet to be created in what we've estimated is the opportunity. But I think this also gives us the opportunity to do things responsibly. My colleagues that work on the clean energy transition are looking at, they've been estimating jobs in that space for more than a decade now. But we also look at, are those, far away in the desert? Are those, more distributed, closer to urban centers, which actually makes it more easy for expanding the workforce to include women? In fact, our report on the green economy has a dedicated chapter on the opportunities specifically for women in the green economy, including as entrepreneurs. We see that as workers, they're mostly concentrated in the lower paying, more laborious segments currently in these types of sectors, whether it's in energy or in nature or in circular economy, etc. So first, getting a sense of what the landscape looks like right now helps us to also see, okay, if we have to tap into this massive opportunity, what might also need to happen simultaneously? How do women, for instance, come up the value chain, get more access to higher paying jobs? And then we also look into what kind of contracts, whether it's women or men or others, what kind of contracts they have, what kind of social security protections do they have, etc. So I think this is, as I said earlier as well, this is a multi-decadal transition, but that does not mean it's far away. The internet, the way we started incorporating it in our lives and our systems and our businesses, say from the mid-90s, has just been a 3-decade story. But it seems like yesterday, but already 3 decades have passed. So when I say decadal transition, it does not mean you wait for a few decades before you do the transition. You start now, and you'll make some errors when you start out, but you'll also correct the course as you go forward, which is why we're trying to shine a spotlight not just on the overall opportunity, but at least in certain market segments and certain value segments. I think this opens up the larger conversation between jobs and livelihoods and entrepreneurship and micro-entrepreneurship. I think we need some nuance there as well. And it might even be the case that the same individual has a job and is also a micro-entrepreneur at different times of the day or different times of the week. So how do we start imagining that different economy of the future, which is not just about, the gig workers that we see, without any social protections or any kind of physical protection, let alone social protection, zipping around town, delivering products to us under 10 minutes. We're trying to imagine something different where this kind of notion of the labor market, the formal insider and the informal outsider, is there something different that we can imagine there? Is the approach we're trying to take here. What was the second question, Sabina?
Sorry, yes. The second question was looking at what are the challenges and progress made at the intersection of climate change, skills development, and platform work? I think
I think I've kind of
sort of
answered
covered
it.
that.
I think one thing we are doing is we are also trying to create a skills mapping tool and a matching tool, not just a mapping, a matching tool to different types of skills needed for different types of sectors and subsectors and geographies, etc. So that those who might begin to see the opportunity here can then also see where those opportunities might arise or in which geographies. So this is also part of our much larger green economy sort of paradigmatic change effort that we are putting in towards this. But these are all sort of works in progress.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Arunabha. I'm mindful that you have another commitment, and so you might be dropping off in the next 5 minutes. So I wanted to just give you a chance to also address these questions. Do you have any, before you leave, Arunabha, do you have any additional thoughts that you'd like to share, even on the previous question that I posed to Andrew with respect to path dependencies and are we capable of making the fundamental changes required to address climate change and/or issues related to climate finance in terms of addressing the just transition imperatives?
I think as it often happens in my dialogues with Andrew, I really appreciate and value the perspectives he brings, and because it shows how much there is in common in how we approach these things, even though our background conditions might be different. So I wanted to reflect on two things that Andrew said, which are also in relation to what you raised. One is on this notion of multiple transitions. I think, Andrew, correct me if you think otherwise, there is an opportunity here for new types of partnerships to be built. Of course, the US has formally exited, but the EU is still in, and some US states are, still committed and so forth. The opportunity here is not just, superficial. The opportunity here is that even in advanced economies, now we are seeing a step change in energy demand curves, primarily driven by the AI revolution, etc. So it was easy to have the more binary conversation where your energy demand curve is flat and say, well, this is a substitution effect. Whereas in emerging markets, not just in India, where the energy demand curve is on the upward rise, it's not a substitution effect. The question is the additive effect, and can I add more clean energy in the broader dirty energy system? But now, as all energy demand curves are up, on the up, maybe with different slopes, I think all economies are going to realize that they need alternative pathways and some nuanced pathways towards this. This opens up a space for that conversation. The other thing I wanted to say on lifestyles that you said, Sabina, and I agree with what Andrew said, but we got to make sustainable lifestyles aspirational. Yes, we have a problem. I wrote about this 2-3 years ago. I said our biggest problem with climate change is that we are hubristic. We think that a techno fix can solve everything. But if we have to look at the other end of the spectrum, and this was our inputs from CW into when the mission life was being written up. So it cannot just be the switching off the lights and the fans. that behavioral nudge must be matched with a supply side intervention which matches the change in demand preferences. So suppose I say I don't want to drive my private car and I would like to take public transport. That's a behavioral nudge. Nice, very nice to hear that. Is there enough supply of public transport in the system? Suppose I say I'm not going to eat meat, but I'm going to switch to, or I'm not going to eat wheat, I'm going to switch to millets. Is there a response from the market in terms of sustainably grown food crops? So and if you take that approach, you realize that the sustainable lifestyle approach need not be a degrowth approach. You're basically opening up new markets that are responding to a lifestyle conscious approach towards consumption. So a demand nudge combined with a supply response, combined with the third pillar, we said, is the change of the aspirations, where that sustainable lifestyle approach itself becomes cool and aspirational. This is much easier said than done, but that again opens up a much larger opportunity for new technologies, new business models, new types of entrepreneurship, new types of policy, which does not feel like you're denying something, but opening up a different space. It's from sacrifice to desire is the larger public consciousness change that we need if we have to truly use sustainable lifestyles as a front and center pillar or approach to climate action.
Great. Thank you so much, Arunabha. Joanes, I'd like to come back to you. I mean, there were many, many things that were brought up by Andrew and Arunabha in terms of obviously the macro picture, but then also really kind of getting more and more granular to how, architectures in developing countries need to change, grow, reform, develop in order to rise, to meet the challenge of climate change adaptation, mitigation, and the energy transitions. And you also talked about the need for policies, regulations, and programs that manage the social impacts of these transitions, right? And you also raised the question of who benefits from this transition, who owns this transition. So I'd like to come back to you, and I think that this sort of might be, we'll see. I'd like to come back to, and we'll see, this might be the final word, but I'd like to understand from you, what do we need in terms of policies, regulations, and programs to protect workers and vulnerable populations as this transition is underway? And can you give us examples of the kinds of things that African governments are doing and the kinds of things that you advise them to do in order to make this a more just and equitable social and economic transition?
Thank you once again, Sabina. Very briefly, there are two important things that are needed in terms of institutional transformation towards just transition in Africa. I think number one is that currently the operationalization of just transition in the continent is still relatively siloed and more focused on energy, which is duly right, because that's where we see a lot of greenhouse gas emission and stuff like that. But the issues around just are actually multi-sectoral. You go to, for instance, agriculture. Now there's very strong or very, very, very significant problem around food insecurity, and the need to, at the same time, the need to really adopt more or less intensive agricultural mechanisms. And across different sectors, transport and stuff like that. So one important thing that African countries would need is basically to have frameworks that can mainstream the just transition agenda across sectors and across different actors. So multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder framework for mainstreaming key provisions of just transition across the different sectors that basically drive development in the continent. At the moment, it's relatively unclear in most of the countries. Like if we look at Kenya, for instance, the focus is basically to achieve universal clean energy. If you look at the electricity sector, to have all households be able to be connected to the grid through subsidies. Of course, if you look at other aspects of cooking, clean cooking, which is very critical. Kenya has, for instance, a target to have by 2028 that all the households or population would be able to access clean cooking technologies. So those ambitions are great, but certainly the need to ensure that they are actually linked to the different sectors that drive those processes is very critical. Number two is the element of tracking and how to really understand whether we are really achieving just transition or we are just doing, implementing transitions. So I think currently one of the major gaps is the lack of, a sort of an integrated tracking and reporting framework that could really show the progress of just transition in the continent. And that's why I want to agree with Arunabha that the need to really look at the landscape and see how is the outlook presented, and to be able to identify those opportunities really for interventions and for protecting and safeguarding jobs within that particular transitions. Indeed, with such frameworks, we may need really critical indicators which are justice-oriented. At the moment, the tracking and reporting of the just transition process, to an extent, is abstractly reported in the context of relatively output or outcome-oriented indicators. Yet, justice in the process is actually embedded in the process. Justice in the transition is actually embedded in the process. So the need for even process-oriented indicators that really can speak to the intersectionality issues around the transition is very critical. And this is a problem even from 𝗽𝗲𝗹. We saw the presentation on the global goal on adaptation, which has been a highly technical process, the 100 indicators that have been developed by experts. And of course, the conversations at 𝗽𝗲𝗹 was really subjecting these to the political process. But if you look at those indicators, they are relatively not speaking to justice. Their output, like the number of people, number of jobs, number of people accessing water, but still really not reflecting on the processes, especially where issues of equity, issues of justice are actually embedded. And from some of the work we've done in Africa, trying to develop indicators with communities in Kenya and in Benin, to just understand what is the aspirations in the transition process. And one thing that comes out is that for communities, it's about the enablers. It's about being able to be empowered to do things in a more sustainable way, to be resilient in a more sustainable way, to use what they have, the indigenous knowledge that they have, to really respond to the transition and shape the transitions. But you look at the national level, and of course I've talked about the global level. This is not the case. The focus at those particular level are indicators that are more targeted at, specific output. So my point here, as I conclude, is that we need institutional changes or reshuffling that basically unpacks or looks back at the spaces where the issues of justice, issues of intersectionality across the different social groups, where all these are located within the different pathways of just transition, and that calls for developing these kinds of tracking and reporting mechanisms that are more socially embedded, but also really speaking to the systemic, the structures within which justice is embedded.
Thank you so much for that, Joanes. I think, again, you raised some really important points about not approaching this in siloed ways and the need for sort of integrated frameworks and indicators that can truly capture the, as we operationalize the just transition roadmaps. I want to just sort of end our conversation today with a couple more questions that have been raised by participants. So one question is, can we possibly forecast a transformation dividend that can be channeled into improving the labor market outcomes of green jobs? And another question was pertaining to the importance of philanthropy, in sort of managing, financing the transitions towards more sustainable economies. So, Joanes, do you have a closing thought that you'd like to share? And then, Andrew, I'd like to come to you to, contribute to both of these questions and then just close out this conversation. Joanes, did you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, not really, but just to emphasize the point around understanding the pathways through which just transition is being operationalized within the different context. And that way, it will really be possible to, have a clear, a clear outlook of where, the issues around jobs are located within that, within the transition. So the need really to embrace that and be able to clearly have a clear lens of justice in the process, I think for me is critical for Africa, so that the aspect of just transition is not lost in the in the process in that way, and that again will shape which kind of financing are more relevant for who and where.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joanes. Andrew, over to you.
Sure. I'm sorry, can you just repeat the transformation dividend question again? I didn't.
Yes. Let me just pull that up. Can we forecast a transformation dividend that can be channeled into improving labor market outcomes of green jobs? What I think the question is asking is, is the transformation, are there incentives related to the transformation that can be attached to sort of transitioning to green jobs?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and I think that's again one of these key things. I remember at the end of the Obama administration, I was involved in some interesting conversations by people. There were a number of people around the Paulson Institute, for example, who were kind of working on these kind of big mega studies on what are the sort of the job growth potential in a energy transition, energy transformation, responding to climate change, things like this. There was a kind of a sort of a downer kind of conclusion in some of those conversations where it sort of said, well, yeah, absolutely, you could imagine that you can employ just as many people in fossil fuel related industries as clean energy industries. I mean, and Sabina, the example that you gave that you sort of challenged us with is to think about how much coal is transported on Indian railways and like what happens to those jobs. This is not an easy thing to wrap your mind around in terms of what we think of as just transition and where's the justice in that, and sort of losing that capacity that is the mainstay of people that are outside of direct extractive industries. So I think that's true, but I think that the other side of it, we then kind of move to this phase of, well, let's count the loss of employment, the loss of working hours that come from climate stressors and impacts. And I worked on the fourth National Climate Assessment, which was, interestingly enough, released, the US National Climate Assessment, which was released during the first Trump administration, without any editing by that administration. They've since canceled the next US National Climate Assessment. But we could show that we can actually count the jobs that are not lost, so that kind of help with that. And you can think of that as a kind of a dividend with respect to, again, what you push me on is making compatible our economic growth, right, with decoupling economic growth with growth in emissions. But I think there's this third thing, and I think you see this in the report that I mentioned that was kind of launched at 𝗽mě, with this new partnership that Kenya and Germany have sort of launched, which was part of the process of leading to the Just Transition Work Program. Once you start expanding this to the bioeconomy, to work on adaptation, and really kind of think of a really focused overall approach to this, and this is something we didn't even mention. We mentioned once, I think Joanes mentioned it, is the sort of the focus on the global goal for adaptation, actually making that a reality, and also increasing finance goals for adaptation now to looking at 140 billion as the goal now annually by 2035 coming out of 𝗽mě. Then you really do see a kind of a broader notion of a dividend with respect to jobs and economic security that we can imagine is something that becomes self-sustaining, which almost allows us to pull focus away from these weird interventions by the United States about whether or not climate change exists or not. You get in an economy built around the solution set, no one's going to pay attention to those things because it just won't matter with respect to a new model of moving forward. And then just briefly, I know we're running out of time, on the philanthropy issue, that's a really, really good question. I think it's absolutely essential. I think one of the ways in which we sort of think about this is that traditionally, philanthropy has this absolutely essential role because it allows experimentation. It allows the incubation of new ideas, of new solution sets that we haven't yet gotten into the mainstream with respect to, major powers like India kind of moving forward and being able to create national missions around things like this. But if you look at things like work on mitigation of short-lived climate pollutants like methane, if we look at things like the beginnings of conversations around, carbon capture and sequestration, things like this, these were really small, minor, marginal conversations. If you go back 15, 20 years with respect to our discussions about what we now think of as global transitions in response to climate change, which were incubated largely out of small pools of money from philanthropies that are really important. And then unfortunately, again, not to bring a downer, but it's really become a lifeline in the United States, where you see a cutoff of funding, basic climate science funding in universities, in our national laboratories, where philanthropies are filling in the gap. Now's the opportunity for philanthropies to put more riders on that, so that work that is done, that is sustained in the United States, despite the federal government getting out of this, making sure that that work actually is more strongly partnered with the Global South, in partners in the Global South in ways that it historically might have not been. So I think that's really something where you've got potentially a new role for philanthropy in creating these networks that can continue whatever our governments do.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. And certainly, I mean, we can see the role of grant funding and philanthropy, and the important role this plays in the work that JustJobs does as well. And we'd certainly be open to more philanthropic funding being directed to research on the just transition. But also, I really appreciated in this conversation how we were able to go from very macro issues to national level issues, even down to the worker and behavioral, aspects of the conversation. So I think this has been a very rich conversation. I'm really grateful to you for joining the conversation from Nairobi and taking the time, and Arunabha and Joanes, to both of you for adding very important regional insights, as well as sort of your engagements with COP30 and the multilateral systems. So thank you so much for what I think has been a really rich discussion. We hope to have you all back in the future to go even deeper into some of the issues that were raised. An hour and a half is never enough time, but thank you to everyone that has joined this conversation today, and we look forward to having you join future webinars. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.